how much of a privilege it is to serve where God has called you to serve, regardless of where that is.
Right.
And that's a blessing.
A lot of pastors would view getting a job in a rural church as a stepping stone to something bigger and better.
Yeah, if you define success by the world's view of success, yes, I'm making a mistake. Honestly, these people are so valuable and important that it is totally worth all of my time and energy and everything God is going to do in and through that community. Like, I'm happy to be there. Like, I love being there. I don't want to move back to a big community.
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Canaan Hurst, and this is episode 10, God is at Work in Rural Churches. So today, I'm super excited to have Jordan Grimms. Jordan, you are pastor of the Colby Wesleyan Church.
That's correct,
right, in Colby, Kansas. Which is a largely agricultural community. In terms of rural areas, it's one of the bigger kind of rural areas, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it would be like a rural hub because we have our own hospital, we have a Walmart. I know it sounds crazy, but like people come to get stuff at Colby.
Yeah.
So we're a bigger rural community.
Yeah, that makes sense. So before we get started into kind of how Colby is and everything, why don't you talk about your journey in pastoring, how you transitioned from a big city to a small city, and why you're at a small church right now?
Yeah. So for me, it's been quite a journey because I didn't even want to be a pastor or work at any church, let alone big or small. And God's kind of made some changes in my life that really now I'm in love with it. But yeah, I mean, so a lot of that journey is with my wife, Michelle. We've been married 12 years, going on 13. We have 3 boys now, Isaiah, Phoenix, and Asher. And so while she was from Colby originally, and that was our main connection there, her parents are farmers in Mingo, which is a smaller town of like 50 outside of Colby. And I was from Oregon originally. And so when we were kind of dating, getting to know one another, she kind of introduced me to this larger church at the time called Solid Rock Jesus Church, because I followed her out there because they had an awesome like college group called The Way, and so I wanted to hang out with her, and so I went out there, even though that wasn't her church, and I heard the preaching of the pastor, and I was so blown away that I had to stay because I didn't have a church at the time. So from there, I'm kind of an all or nothing person, so I just kind of tried to jump all in as much as I could, and I joined the kids ministry there, and so the church generally was a church of about 5,000, but like not all of that 5,000 was there on a Sunday. It's probably 5,000 they consider it to be their church home.
Gotcha.
But they have, while I was there, they would have like 4 services, and so it was busy. The kids ministry would range between 400 to 600 kids on a Sunday, and the kids pastor at the time, after I got involved with 4th and 5th graders, he actually asked me to be on the teaching team because he was very largely into development. He wants to develop people. He wants to pour into you. And the things that he was really gifted in areas that he could see that he needed other people to come alongside. And then when he found those people, he poured a lot into those people. And I was one of those people. And so eventually I came on to staff at that church and for kids ministry. Eventually was running all of kindergarten through 5th grade. And at the time, our special education, special needs ministry as well. And so I spent a lot of time there, and it was actually honestly amazing. I went from not ever wanting to work at a church and resisting it at first when they asked me, to feeling just a powerful call to ministry and a powerful call to be a part of just seeing the church grow and move forward. Instead of just being angry at some of the imperfections in the church, contributing to the growth of the church, hopefully in a healthy way, even though I know I'm not perfect myself. And so, kind of from there, my wife and I got married about the same time I started on staff there.
Yeah, okay.
And so we actually started going back and visiting every single time I had vacation time out to Colby. So that was all of our vacation
Was in
for until
Colby.
we moved out there was in Colby. And so we'd fly out because our parents were out there in Mingo. And so I started slowly getting used to the community out there. Um, but at first I was pretty resistant to being in Colby. Honestly, I had a lot of pride that I didn't know that I had accumulated. Because coming into a leadership position at a large growing church in my mid 20s, and eventually at one point, my mentor Bucky, he actually went on to lead a ministry called Fly Fishing Collaborative, and he left, and he just let my friend and I know. He's like, "I've trained you up for this. You got this. I have faith in you, and I'm going to go do what God's called me." And so at a young age, my friend and I, Peter, and a few others, were running this ministry and getting calls and emails from people all over the state, but then all over the country, because we were generally around the second largest kids ministry in the state. And so people wanted to know, what were you doing well? Why is this working? How can we
Yeah,
get
of
advice
course.
from
Yeah.
you? And unknowingly, that kind of that built my pride up a little bit. And so when I first started going into some of the processing about rural communities, I loved getting a break, but I didn't want to live there. I didn't want to do ministry there. I didn't want to give up what I felt like God had given to me in such great quantity, and the success and all those things that I viewed as success at the time. And so for me, it had to do a lot with dealing with a lot of internal pride issues. And over the years, we ended up visiting for the 10 years until we moved out there multiple times a year. And so I got a really good view of the rural community in that time. But at the same time, I still remember when God pretty much, I don't know if you've had those times where it's almost been for me, it's the closest time that I've had to a spoken word. I've never heard the audible voice of God, but the closest thing. And
Yeah.
for me, it sounded like this. It sounded like, I love the rural community, and the rural community deserves awesome expressions of my church, just like anywhere else. And it was both said in a loving, it felt like a loving tone, but also a corrective tone to my attitude. And from that point on, honestly, God kind of lit a fire for me in the rural community, because our church, what we plant churches in other cool places is what they would, honestly, I don't think they would ever put that on their tagline or
Okay.
explanation.
Yeah. Right. Right.
But they did. I mean, I remember them talking about Boulder or other areas that are
For your church in Portland was
cool to plant
Totally.
in those areas. Colby was never going to be on that radar.
Yeah.
And so at that point, God kind of then started doing big change in my life, and dealing with the pride and stoking the fire and passion for the rural community. And it took a few years after that for my wife and I to really not only just to get fully excited ourselves, but also for God to open up a door for us to actually move out and be a part of that community.
Yeah.
And so that actually happened and kind of started happening in March of 2020. Went out for my brother-in-law's wedding. Got pretty much after the wedding, got stuck out there because COVID shut down Oregon.
Right.
Yeah, and that was ended up being almost a blessing in the sense to where we were stuck out on a farm instead of in our home, and not able to go out there. We had a whole farm that we were able to access, and
Yeah.
you're just naturally social distanced.
Exactly.
So,
Seriously.
and so that ended up being a really positive part of that. But in that time, we had already been in communication with Colby Wesleyan Church. I'd never heard of the Wesleyan denomination really, but before that, and God kind of opened up some powerful doors in ways that is kind of like, well, of course he's the one leading it, because otherwise how is this happening?
Yeah, exactly.
And as he opened those doors, we just kept the conversation going. So I was working at the church online because we had online stuff going for the mega church that I was at in Oregon. And then I was finishing my interview process. And as far as my superintendent told me, I was the first one to do my candidacy teaching over Facebook Live.
Oh, nice.
So,
Okay.
At least for them, for the district, for at least the Kansas district. And the church, we did an interview on Facebook Live and stuff like that. And then they ended up offering me the job, and I started in June 1st, 2020.
That's awesome. What a great story. I mean, you bring up kind of the pride of influence, that like perceived influence over big
Right.
numbers will give someone, and you're absolutely not alone. So many people have dealt with that. I think it's super interesting to think, like, from what I've heard, a lot of pastors would view getting a job in a rural church as a stepping stone to something
Right. Yep.
bigger and better. But like, I mean, that's pretty sad, right? Because if someone's
Yeah.
already looking two churches down the line as they're
Yes.
supposed to be kind of shepherding and pastoring, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the hurtful things. I mean, generally, this sounds bad. Like the rural community needs churches, and they need pastors. Because it is like less and less people are going to get their degrees and become pastors, and even fewer of those want to be in a rural community. And most of those people, unfortunately, see it as a stepping stone moving on to a bigger church. And so, a lot of people, when I'm transitioning out of Portland to Colby, Kansas, are like, "Really?" Well,
Yeah.
I'm like, "Yeah, if you define success by the world's view of success, yes, I'm making a mistake. But if I'm defining success by God's view of success, and He has called me and my family here, then I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's a powerful opportunity, not just a wasted opportunity or something that where I'm looking to jump on to the next big and better thing. Whereas honestly, these people are so valuable and important that it is totally worth all of my time and energy and everything God um, is going to do in and through that community. Like I'm happy to be there. Like I love being there. I don't want to move back to a big community.
Right. There, from what I understand, there's just a feeling of amongst a lot of folks in rural communities of just kind of being left behind, kind of being forgotten. Is that something that you've seen, or because I think a lot of our resources and our things are just all focused on metro areas, right?
Yeah, I would say that one of the blessings that I've experienced coming into the rural community was joining a rural church network. And it was a really new network when I joined it when I came in 2020. It's called Dirt Roads Network, and Steve McVeigh leads it. And it was honestly one of the best blessing surprises that I received because it allowed me to network with other rural church pastors that are already and have been doing rural church ministry. It allowed me to help transition my mind from Portland, Oregon, church of 5,000 to ministering in Colby, Kansas, town of 5,000. Um, and it was beautiful because obviously there's differences, but it's helpful talking to people that are actually ministering in those settings. But yeah, one of the things that you heard and the reason this network was created was most of this stuff is focused on the larger church or the church in a larger city or area, and the resources have them. Like Denver or Portland, conferences want to come to those areas. They don't want to come to Colby, Kansas, even though we actually just put in a brand new event center that's like a multi-million-dollar event
Wow.
center. But there are those misconceptions about whether it's worth it or not. And it's really been hurtful for those pastors that's what they've grown up in. I've been actually really blessed, and I don't know how the whole Wesleyan denomination is in this regard, but at the Kansas district, with Nate Rovenstein as our superintendent, he's been really supportive. They actually pay because it costs money for us to be part of the they call it a cooperative instead of a cohort, because that's kind of the language that people out there understand is cooperative instead of cohort. But they actually value the rural community so much, and he's a brand new. He started as a superintendent for the district just like a month or so before I
Okay.
got the position. So he's relatively new, but he has a really strong support of the rural community. So they actually pay for us so that we can be a part of it. So it doesn't have to come out of our church's budget,
Sure.
but the district kind of foots that bill. And it's been good, and it's been really powerful for those rural pastors to actually have community. Even though we're having to do it over Zoom, it's still really been powerful.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. I mean, you mentioned the transition from Portland to Colby. When you actually transition, and then It's awesome to hear that you had mentors to help you along. But
Yeah.
what were some of the biggest changes just in ministry in an urban context to ministry in a rural context?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the biggest things was just the weather difference between Oregon and Colby. Like, Oregon's a pretty moderate climate. And for us, like we had the beach an hour away, and that was one of my big prayer areas, to go and have prayer retreat. So what a prayer retreat and different things and how that happens. Like, I don't know the areas anymore, and that's true for any new area that you're in. But the cold is colder out there. The hot is hotter. And the wind, I mean, we get up to 70, 80 mile an hour winds. And it's windy a lot. It's not always that windy a lot, but it's windy a lot. And so it's a different climate. And you have to get used to the fact that, there's 5 restaurants instead of 500. But honestly, for me, the people have made up for it. I love the people. I love the area. And honestly, I love running into people left and right. Like, I love running into people that I know and I don't know and get to build those relationships. And so it was actually a positive surprise and change in being able to go to the different stores, and you're constantly running into people in the community. So literally every single time I go out my door is a ministry opportunity to the whole community, and people, because I could run into anyone at any point. And I actually like that. Some people feel like that's a lot of pressure on them because they can't, just chill and relax. And for me, it's like, I mean, that's what God's called us to do. I shouldn't be a different person inside my door than I am outside my door. So I shouldn't be bummed that anybody runs into me at any point. Yeah. So, but some of those things have been different. I mean, the only few surprises that I had and one of them was just really that I was kind of bummed because when I got out there, the Minister Alliance had already fallen apart a few years before. And so there's a team of us right now working on, we've got it back up and going again. But it took a little bit of time to do that. And I really value working with other churches. And so we have a really diverse group of churches right now that we're working with. It's not as many as I'd like. There's about 7 of us working together. But that was kind of a bummer, but it turned into an opportunity for us to, I guess, to kind of start over and kind of do something new. There was a lot of new pastors. I know a lot of pastors that have come into the Colby community don't last long because they don't really count the cost. I just was in the passage preaching in Luke where it talks about counting the cost. I think they forget to count the cost, and they come out there and they're like, oh, there's not a lot of stores. You have to drive an hour and a half to get to Home Depot or whatever it is. And for me, I guess I'm okay with that. And so, like, a lot of the transitional points was more just the transition of knowing the people, or, like, for example, what type of ministries stick out to people that they actually want to participate in. Like when we were planning marriage stuff, the church I came from, we had a lot of success with having people come to us, like in the building, in that sense of like, we did other retreats, but people would do like a week after week after week after week alpha event or whatever it was, to get developed, and they'd come to us. But out here, like, they want to go out and do a retreat someplace, and having more than a few weeks in a row, so some of the ministry expectations that I got used to and how they worked changed for the community. And some of it was work related. They're just like, well, if we're going to be on a retreat, we want to be someplace where our boss can't get a hold of us. Not in a bad way, but they want to be able to focus on what God's doing. And so just the way they even viewed those things was a little different. But yeah, for the most part, it's just been a transition of relationship, of getting to know the people at the church, like even during COVID, which we were blessed because we didn't have a long shutdown. I mean, we only had a few months of things shut down. Still, people stayed away. Some of them did until the vaccines came out and different stuff, depending on their perspective on that. But for the most part, it was just that transition. And even my wife and I getting to know who our friends are, like, the friends that I left, even Peter, who we still try to talk to on a weekly basis. Yeah, that part's hard.
Yeah. Are there many other people your age, your kind of same place in life out in Colby, or what's the kind of demographic of your city?
Yeah, I mean, my age, yes. The the college age, less. I mean, there's a community college there. It's a 2-year community college, um, and so that is nice.
Yeah.
Um, it does bring college students in the area, but a lot of times they are really established in their communities, and so they'll drive back home if they're
Oh,
not in the
okay.
dorms. Um, and so a lot of times the college generation wants to get out. Um, but you do see when people start getting married and having kids that they're like, oh, I want to raise my kids back in a real smaller community. And so they'll come back. Um, and there are tons of job opportunities there for people my age. Like, I mean, we have a huge need for nurses and doctors and all sorts of stuff, like really, and teachers, lots of stuff. So there's lots of opportunities for people in my age, and in my stage of life to have opportunity in Colby. But the kind of that college generation is the one that's trying to figure out, do I really want to be there? And like, I know quite a few of them that are in Denver here, and that prefer being in the city. And I guess I just live my life that way already, and I'm okay with not being there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's a good segue into like, there are a lot of misconceptions about smaller
Yeah.
communities, and since I'm know basically nothing about them, I want to ask you, yeah, what do people kind of outside of a rural community get wrong about thinking when they think about a rural community?
Yeah. Well, one of them is that we don't have the same problems, which is a big myth. Like, honestly, yes, the number of people that have drug problems in Colby is not the same as the number of people in Portland, but there's way more people. But the percentage of people that struggle with drugs, we'll say, is higher in Colby than it is in Portland. Um, and I mean, again, I haven't looked at the new stats for Portland. Maybe it's gone up, and that's not true anymore.
But still, it's
But
yeah,
yeah, it's a higher percentage of people that actually struggle with those issues, and some of it is the isolation, and some of it is honestly the lack of things to do. For the younger people in the communities, not as much for the older people in the community that feel
right.
that, but a lot of the younger people in the community, it's easy to get sidetracked because what do they do on their free time? And there's not many options, and the churches in there have tried different ways of interacting with the younger people in the community, that have even gotten kind of shut down even by different whatever reasons, whether it's legal or things people don't want something to happen. And so it's been meeting the young people has been a hard thing. And so, yeah, I mean, that's one that we don't have the same problems, because we do. You know, it's not just all nice and perfect out in the rural community. I mean, I wish it was, but it's not. Um, and another one is all rural communities are the same.
Mm.
You know, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen them all, and that's just not true. Each one has its own story and its own background. And as I've been out in Colby, you know, it sounds weird to say, but I've been trying to go to they have a museum out there and different things. I've been trying to learn specifically about their local history, and what makes them unique as a community. And I think that's important because, you know, a lot of the communities that we deal with, you know, because we have right down the street, Oakley is a town that's even smaller than ours, right down the street, and it has a different history than ours. And so making an assumption that all rural communities are the same, therefore that all their needs are the same, or in that regards, that these churches, and hear this a lot actually, not in these words, but in the way we were talking earlier about people moving on so quickly, like they've already thought 2 churches past the rural community church, is that we are the minor leagues. We get like people feel that all the time, and honestly, um, that's really hurtful for the community, because they do want to grow and get to know people, and you know, we hear stuff like they're out of touch with the country, with the different conversations, or they're out of touch politically, or they're stuck in the past, unwilling to change. I hear that a lot, and honestly, I don't think that has to do with rural or like big or large or small or whatever.
Yeah.
There are a lot of churches that are massive churches that don't want to change,
Yeah, absolutely.
and there are small churches that don't. But my experience has been at the church that I'm at Colby Wesleyan Church, is that they've gone through some hard seasons of life, and they just want to see God move. Um, and so, yes, are some changes hard and uncomfortable? Yeah, but they want to do what it is that God's called them to do, even if it's uncomfortable, you know. But also, me as a pastor, I have to be aware of that and not just smash it into them. But you pastor people through and you work with them as a community and loving them, and it helps when you actually get to know the community and the uniquenesses of that community. And you don't consider them the minor leagues. And I mean, we're building a house out there, and so they can actually look down the street and be like, "Oh no, he's actually committed to this community."
Yeah.
And I've talked to many pastors out there already. That they're not there anymore, but they were. They were like, "Yeah, I don't know how long I'll be here." I'm like, "Well, I'm committed all in here, and as far as I know, I'm going to be dying here, unless God says something I'm not aware of."
Yeah.
But I think even having that different state of mind as a pastor in there, like, don't be looking for that next big opportunity, but be where you're at. And the last one is that a small community or church means they are better at living life together. And so that is sometimes that's true,
Yeah.
but it's not always true. Just because they're in a smaller community doesn't mean necessarily like community is all of a sudden easy for them.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually one of the things as a church that we are wanting to grow in, because like when it comes to taking care of our people in need, man, they step up real quick. But even out there, you ask, like, has somebody had you over to their house? Is like the week to week, living day to day stuff. Like that for us is something to where I can see still a lot of growth needed. And so it's not like, oh yeah, they're right down the street from you. You know, it's the same thing when I was in Portland. My neighbors didn't want to talk to me. You know, you even bring them cookies and goodies and they don't want to talk to you. And it's not like that. I mean, honestly, I will say pretty much everybody in Colby, they are willing to stop and talk to you, which makes it a lot easier.
Totally.
Like the farmers that are working crazy hours out there, like working super hard, like they will stop and talk to you. And so, I mean, that definitely is one thing that like I've noticed, like they will work hard, but they will stop and talk to you. They will pull over if you need something. But it doesn't mean that they're perfect in how they do community. And the last thing that just came to my mind is, I don't think I've heard anybody say this, but I get the picture of this from different people I've interacted with, is that people in the rural community are less intelligent. And I think the reason they have that and what they really mean is that there's less academia, there's less degrees, like, but for me, that's kind of been a hurtful thing, because I mean, I'm getting my master's and I understand it. So like, I guess I'm not in that group, but like my father-in-law, built his farm from nothing. And I've been really proud to see where he's at now. Obviously I didn't see him back then because I didn't know him, but I've been really really encouraged to see where he's at.
Yeah.
And honestly, the amount of balls that they have to juggle and learning all the different rules about everything, all the different aspects of farming, they're so complex, honestly, that when I was in Portland, it was easy to boil it down to like, oh, they're just farming sort of idea, or like they're just farmers, or yeah, you know, and it's just the attitude is, but it's like, wow, if you actually really followed a farmer around for a month, I doubt you could keep up. And the amount of things that they're having to learn and do, and fix and all that stuff, like, I feel like just because they don't have a degree doesn't mean that they're not just as brilliant as anybody else. And so that kind of myth of kind of like down to earthness of a farmer doesn't mean that they're also not quite bright and intelligent and amazing people when it comes to the giftings God's given them. That honestly, for me, I'm like, I wasn't given that gifting. I'm glad they were, because I was not given that gifting.
In fact, the down to earthness is a more healthy emotional intelligence than the opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people here, especially as, you know, rural communities, I think overall, or actually, I don't know this. I'm curious what you'd say. This might be a misconception, but from what I, at least culturally, have understood, is that lots of rural communities are decreasing in size as urban areas are rapidly growing. Is that something that you've seen around Kansas, around Colby?
Yeah, again, it's the same concept that every rural community is different. And so again, it goes into the history. Like a lot of these rural communities that sprouted up at the time, it was all around transportation areas. So whether it's Colby or Oakley or the different communities that are there, there was trains. Having trains that came in was a
Yeah.
big deal because they could send stuff out. When I-70 was put in, that was a big deal for those towns that had I-70. The ones that we're seeing didn't, that didn't get the same transportation, and obviously a road can't hit every single place. Those ones that aren't on that kind of economic support, yeah, it is. Colby is actually growing. It's about 5,500 right now, and I talked with the mayor there and was getting to know him, and he's really hoping to see it hit six in the next number of years. And we have tons of jobs. Our actually problem is that we don't have enough houses for the people, which is why we had to build. We really didn't have much of a choice. There
Wow.
wasn't much option.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's so real. Not every rural community is exactly the same. Of course,
Yeah.
not every city is the
Right.
same. Why aren't we treating our or viewing our rural cities the same way we view our larger metro areas? That they're unique. The problems are different. The people are different. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Absolutely. Has your day-to-day changed since being in a mega church to being in a small church, small community?
Yes and no. I mean, again, I was in ministry before. This is the first time I've been like in a full pastorate, and so that changes things. But one of the changes is that just that, like in a rural church, again, you're a generalist. You do everything, and so that's kind of similar to the way kids ministry functioned for us. Like our department, for good or for bad, was a little bit siloed, and so we did a lot. We functioned a lot on our own, and when you're that big, a kids ministry is like its own little church within a church. And that's not always a good thing. But for us, honestly, when I was transitioning over here, is more just taking it back, and I had to kind of, in a sense, be aware of all the different hats turning. I did my first funeral just a few months ago. I'd already done a number of weddings, so I was used to that because I was at a young church. People got married. My volunteers got married. I had over 100 volunteers that I was managing, and some of them were bound to get married when they're younger. But luckily in kids ministry, even though there were a few kids that unfortunately passed away, like I didn't do any of the funerals. And so like having to add some of those extra things on and learn some of those things has been a growing and stretching experience. But yeah, I can't just focus in, even if I wanted, like the church I was at, our teaching pastor, he could work on this sermon for 40 hours a week. And he did other stuff too, but like you can focus in. Generally with the mega church, you have specialists, and less generalists in there. You have a few, but then in like the rural churches, you kind of have generalists. They still have their things that they're gifted in more than others.
Yeah.
But yeah, so having to kind of be aware of everything kind of going on, is a little bit different. And not having the support of a bunch of pastors that are able to reach out to lots of different people, and it kind of being like on my shoulders more. I've actually having to learn more and more how to like wear the churches out so I can start developing people to even start handing stuff off to, because even in a church of 70 on a Sunday, like we are, like you still can't reach every single person perfectly.
Right.
And so trying to figure out how to develop people in the community to also help take care of other people in the community.
You rely on yourself and a bunch of or as many volunteers as you can get, can wrangle. And sometimes that's zero, right? And sometimes that's a lot more. But something you brought up, that your community is really, really, like so many people in your community are really good at stopping and giving the time of day to talk. And it's just so rare in urban contexts.
Yes.
I'm assuming that's something churches and church leaders in urban contexts can learn from. And how can you cultivate kind of a spirit of generosity relationally, or, you know, I know that's probably a really hard question because there's no real,
Yeah.
straightforward answer to
Yeah.
that.
I mean, and we're still growing in ourselves. Like, I would say that we're really gifted, and like there's different dimensions of relational generosity. Um, and I think we're really gifted in a few of those ways, and people are at least willing. Whereas when I was in the Portland area, people are just at full speed walking past it, doing their thing, um, unless they were asking you for money.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
for me, um, honestly, I've kind of just had to realize that even my focus as a pastor kind of affects some of that. Um, it's kind of the old conversation of the consumerism view of we've we've we as pastors are partially responsible for creating the consumeristic model that people are experiencing because it's partially what we gave them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we're responsible for what we teach. And so I think, especially post COVID, you can either see this as the most awful thing in the world, or you can see, okay, what opportunities is God opening? And I think relational opportunities, people are in need. They wanted that. They already needed it, but it was highlighted to the nth degree.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's like, okay, so this is just another opportunity for God to move. So as a pastor, just really understanding that I need to be living this out myself. And then if this is really important, is this something that we're actually highlighting as a church? And that is, again, and it's one of our measures of success in our church that we just started because we want to grow in that area ourselves. But I think it takes a lot of work, and it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. I imagine that some of your members, or a lot of your members, live kind of sprawled out,
Yes,
all
absolutely.
over the
Yeah.
place. So,
Yeah.
and that's something that's different from a small, kind of localized urban context church like the one that I'm a part of, where, we've got like a couple square miles that
Right.
we like try to, and a lot of our people live in, and so we can walk places and things like that. What is kind of neighborhood integration, or being in proximity to your people look like, especially when a lot are kind of spread out?
It just involves a lot of intentionality, like a lot of rural churches. Like I loved it. The church I was part of, at one point, they focused in a lot more on making sure people weren't driving from 4 hours away. Because we had people driving from all the way from Eugene to come up to Portland
Wow.
for our church. And our pastor at the time, John Mark Comer, he really emphasized, hey, go to church where you're at, like be in your local community. And he took a lot of hit for that because, again, a lot of the megachurch model can be just get as many people in the building as possible,
Right.
not dissuade people from coming into your building. And he wasn't saying that you should never come if you weren't there. And he understood that there's seasons of life for different stuff. But he really emphasized the fact that we need to be involved in community where we're at.
Yeah.
In a rural context, people's community is a little bit broader. Like driving a few hours is normal. And it's not you're driving really 10 miles in nonstop traffic. It's like
Yeah.
you're just far away from people. And so churches tend to need to be more regional. And so whether it's you see people from the whole county or whatever it is, it's one of those areas that where I think it takes a lot of intentionality, because for the farmers and different people that I connect with, it involves going out to be with them at their house, not always making them come to you. So most of the people are in town, but then you have a lot of people that aren't. And so honestly, it's just intentionality on my part. And sometimes I do a really good job, and sometimes studies and everything else kind of blind me, and I realize I haven't gone out and visited somebody.
Sure. And that's another kind of, aspect of wearing a million different hats, as a small church pastor. So your neighborhood is just a lot bigger, but people aren't driving 2 hours to come to church because you're the coolest, hippest, biggest
No.
church. They're driving sometimes because you're the closest one to them, or their church home, or they live so far away that
Right now we mostly have people. I mean, we had somebody driving 2 hours for a little bit, but for the most part, our longer drives are like 30 minutes one way and 30 minutes back.
Yeah,
But it does make it hard for like volunteers. Like for one of our worship our worship team, and for her to come out and practice, and she's a young mom. It's a big commitment, and so it does affect our, like, how can we practice, when can we practice, what does
yeah,
practice actually look like, and for volunteers and for expectations when they have to drive in for 30 minutes and even bring maybe their whole family with them, and then drive back out.
sure, yeah. I'm curious what navigating as a pastor the political landscape in a rural
Hmm.
context is like, because that kind of goes, I feel like, to another misconception, which is people who in urban metro areas have a lot of thoughts about maybe what's going on in the hearts and minds of folks in the rural community, but you get to see up front you know what the needs and the desires and the feelings are from people out there, but also um, how kind of complex it is to hold a really divisive thing while managing or leading your people.
Yeah, I mean, like the most of the people in Colby, honestly, I would say, are more politically active, than in my experience, like, in the Portland area. There was a lot of, I mean, it was getting more active, but there's a higher majority of people that actually participate in the political, like
That's good.
they see that it's an important thing to participate in,
Yeah.
and they make it an effort. They make an effort to participate in it. And so, I mean, that's one of the positive things I've noticed. I mean, it is a primarily conservative community, and our church is primarily conservative politically as well. Um, and we'll see if we'll see if the community part changes, because people are moving to try to get out some of the towns and coming into the rural communities. And so, one of the things that I know a lot of rural pastors and people are keeping an eye on right now is, so what does that look like for the landscape of the rural community that was so used to doing and thinking one way,
Yeah.
and now has different people coming in.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, for the most part, we're conservative. But like, I can say from my church, I know there's unhealthy spectrums. I would actually say that I'm blessed to be in a church that's really healthy and that really does have a kingdom first perspective. Um, like the people that I talk to in my church, they really see their kingdom citizenship first. The fact that, like, of course we want to be active and involved, but really Jesus is the only way that lives are going to be transformed. And we're blessed to be in a place to where we can participate, and so we should, in whatever way we can. And so, like, I love the passage of Jeremiah 29:4-9, and I know it's primarily focused on the Exodus, when they were in Babylon, but God is instructing them through Jeremiah on how to live in exile, and it says this: "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon: Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." And so, yeah, again, that is primarily speaking of that time in Israel, but I think the overarching principle is something that is active in our community. Is like, we are in this community, we want to see the people in the country succeed, um, and so that means being active participants, in that. And sure, I know that there are some people, I'm sure, that have really unhealthy and mean views about that, and that take it too far, on both sides of the spectrum.
Sure.
Um, but I feel pretty blessed to be part of a church that um, that they're still very strongly rooted in the authority of Scripture, and they're still really strongly rooted in their kingdom citizenship first and foremost, and then from there, really believe that they are called to be active participants
Yeah.
in the political system and what it brings.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked on this podcast a lot about political engagement, civic witness, kind of seeing how decisions on the local level really impact and affect your neighbors,
Mm-hmm.
and just making a case for actually knowing the people
Yeah.
who are, managing and elected in your town, whether or not you participate in that, they are making decisions that impact you and,
Yep.
and the people around you. You said you had you have a relationship with the mayor. Has that allowed you to kind of see some of the needs you didn't know before, maybe meet some of those things?
I contacted him. He offered to drive me around the community
Oh,
and
cool.
show me stuff. And he is a really nice guy. One of the biggest things that's been helpful for me in learning the community is just hanging out and talking with people in different aspects. And so, Colby is a largely Caucasian community, but it has a growing Hispanic community from all different Hispanic countries. And so I've spent a lot of time talking and even interviewing and getting to know those in the Hispanic community. And that's been a challenging yet really powerful experience because honestly, when I came out there, I was kind of curious to see how, especially with the political climate of racism and stuff like that, how that was handled in Colby. And so when I talked with one of the gals out there who's Hispanic, she runs a local business out there, and I was interviewing her for one of my master's assignments because I see her as a local community leader, and she's awesome. So I got to interview her and her daughter, and I was shocked because when we talked about racism, when we brought it up, she thought for a while, and then she's like, honestly, from the people of Colby, I have not experienced any racism. I was shocked by that. And she clarified, she's like, I'm sure there are people that are racist here, but the people that have interacted with me, and that have chosen to come to her business, are super, super supportive and have been phenomenal, fellow community members. And she has really appreciated that a lot. In fact, she said, unfortunately, most of the racism that her and her family receives is from people that are driving through. Since we're on I-70, it's really busy. And so most of the stuff that they've actually experienced is from people with out-of-state tags and different stuff that are coming through, stopping eating at the restaurant. And so I was really pleasantly surprised to hear that, to hear just the value that they have for one another, especially at that time with seeing everything blow up in Portland itself, and all the different riots and different stuff going on, and really wanting to hear from the Hispanic community how they feel like they've been treated. And it takes time to get to know people and to earn the right for them to be honest with you and stuff like that. But yeah, it's been a good conversation to have. I mean, honestly, I've been proud of our church. Like they've wanted to do everything possible to not even have our church feel like a Caucasian church, but to feel like a church that everybody that wants to know Jesus and wants to fall in love with Jesus can come into, no matter if they're white or Hispanic. And I've been actually really, really, really impressed, so
that's
a good
beautiful.
surprise.
Yeah.
That was a good surprise. I know that's
great.
not everywhere in the country right now.
Right.
And that's not what people think of when they think of most rural communities.
Yeah.
So,
that's really beautiful, though.
yeah.
And it's good to know. I mean, because again, it goes back to this, not all rural communities are the same.
Right.
Don't use one to judge the other.
Right.
I noticed that because especially being spread out, a lot of your members having to be really intentional about keeping relationships and things. I'm sure it's been in some ways more challenging to understand the immediate needs of some people. But I actually saw on your website that you guys do like a kids closet with free clothing. You do community weekly meals. Can you talk about some of those rhythms that you do to kind of maintain just a level of care for the community based on what they need?
Yeah, I mean, one beautiful thing about the rural community is that they care about the community a lot.
Yeah.
I think it's been interesting when I was in Portland, starting to see, and in the Beaverton area more specifically. But when I was there, they started having farmers markets and different stuff, and there's like, oh, and they wanted to promote supporting the community. That's already how the rural community was. Like they wanted to support each other and people in the community, and so honestly, for us, that's an important thing. And I know not every church does, just because they're in the rural community, again, doesn't mean every single church does stuff in and for the community per se. Um, but it's been an important part of our church, and parts that have been growing and changing. Yeah, we do a kids closet, and started out primarily for the families in our church that were foster parents, and then kind of expanded, and eventually we have 4 classrooms right now full of clothes, and so that's been really helpful. We do meals, and right now specifically really focusing on youth, middle school, and high school in that regards. So we do provide a meal there for them, and then we try to participate. Like I've told the church, we try to participate. The things in the town that are good things, we should be fully behind. So like they have a local fair carnival thing that is awesome. And so this last few years, we've tried to help run rides because they have a hard time getting volunteers for them. And so finding things that are in the community that are really awesome, positive things in the community, that they're already doing that we can come alongside of. And then trying to look for the areas that they have need, that they don't have. Like, I mean, mental health is a huge problem in the rural communities. We don't have enough counselors. We don't have enough really anything for mental health. And it's getting better, but there's still stigma around it.
Sure.
And so for me, like I have anxiety, and so I take medication every day. And so I share my journey in my sermons and different stuff
That's good.
to help destigmatize it. But honestly, in those areas, we just need a lot of support because it's just not there. And so what does that look like? Sometimes you can do something as a church about something directly, and sometimes not as much, but we can help destigmatize it, and we can help let people know it's okay to get help and seek support, even if we're not professional counselors ourselves.
Yeah.
So
Provide a safe space, and a part of that is saying it's okay to seek it out somewhere else.
Right. You know what? I think for me, honestly, I just want people to know that God's still moving in the rural community. And like I said, like not every rural community is the same. And yes, you might not be called to be in a rural community, or you might not be called a pastor in a rural community. But it's still valued deeply by God, and the people out there are loved deeply. And so like as we're in the midst of in a community, in a climate right now where there's a lot of attacking of different people without getting to know them.
Yeah, exactly.
I would just encourage people to actually stop and get to know people in the rural community before they make a judgment, and actually understand that if they are in ministry and God could be calling them to the rural community, it's not awful. It's great. I love it. And there's awesome, unique opportunities in the rural community and possibilities. Honestly, in small churches, it's easier to mobilize small churches in some ways. It's not always.
Right.
But when you have a smaller ship to turn, it sometimes can be easier to turn the ship. And honestly, one of my favorite parts is just that I get to know people in a really powerful way in my congregation because there's less of them. I'm not trying to get to know 5,000 people. I mean, I am because the whole town's 5,000.
But yeah.
But like my church is not that big, and so it allows me to love on them in a powerful way. And so I think for me, just remember that God's moving all over the country, and some of that looks unique in different areas. But for me, I really want to see the Spirit move throughout the whole country and throughout the whole world. And I don't think, we should look down on churches no matter where they're at, but see where we can rally together, and support one another.
Yeah.
And so I just love the rural community, and I wish more and more people would understand the privilege that it is It's not a stepping stone. It's not the minor leagues.
Yeah.
How much of a privilege it is to serve where God has called you to serve, regardless of where that is.
Right.
And that's a blessing.
Yeah. And humans are humans everywhere. If
Right.
they're in
We're
New
broken
York City
everywhere.
or Colby or yeah. The problems might look a little different, but
Right.
yeah, absolutely. And like, cause your people can tell if you're pastoring them and it's clear that you're thinking two churches ahead.
Yes, they can.
And that's another
Yes,
thing.
they
Yeah.
can.
It's, you don't insult the intelligence of someone by saying, well, I can think way ahead.
Right.
This is my stepping stone.
They don't know. They know
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you're not really in tune to them.
I feel like we say all the time, oh yeah, pastoring or discipling one person is just as important as a bunch of different people. But do we actually practice that, especially in a place that's not the coolest, sexiest town in America right now? Well, thank you so much for being on, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Really beautiful story. And I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Canaan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Krysl. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.